Hello and welcome to my little trip down road testing memory lane. Today's a Q&A video, so thanks very much for sending in all your questions and comments. Really interesting, much appreciated. So let's crack on with the first one, which is from Mr. Doodle. Hello Mr. Doodle. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on Yamaha's first crossplane R1, 2009. From an aesthetic point of view, I thought it was a big step backwards, rather like the 2006 Kawasaki ZX-10R. Big undertail exhaust, making the bike look overweight from a visual point of view. And for what? Just chasing the trend at the time, which was the legacy of the Ducati 916 designs and style. It didn't seem to gain many plaudits for handling from the motorcycle press at the time. The rather blank side fairing and questionable looking front lights also did not start any new trends. In my opinion, Yamaha have struggled from a style point of view, the R1 since that time. Though the latest version is the best effort post the crossplane crank change. Style versus functionality is always going to compete, I guess. I guess it's the same with any product. Loving your videos and opinions. Well, thanks for asking. Thank you for your question. Yeah, the 2009 Yamaha R1 is a really interesting one. It's quite a divisive motorcycle, both with from owners, from racers, from bike journalists. They kind of really split into two camps. You kind of had the people that had the Ben Spies experience with the R1. It was all good, and then I guess you'd have the people that have the Rob Mack racing experience with the R1, which wasn't so good. So, I mean, if you talk about when it was unveiled to the press, it was a big deal. It was all about the crossplane crank engine, the irregular firing order, the fact that the engine philosophy had come from Yamaha's MotoGP bike, the M1, and it's the kind of configuration of engine that Rossi chose when he joined Yamaha in 2004. When he tested all the different engines, he didn't go for the screamer as they call it. He went for the crossplane big bang, or long bang as it actually is. So it was an exciting proposition. We rode it for the first time at Eastern Creek and was absolutely fantastic. It felt really, really strange compared to any four-cylinder superbike we'd ridden before because of that characteristic. It's really odd, still even odd by today's standards. It's kind of got the mid-range of a V4 or a V twin. It's kind of got the smoothness in terms of power delivery of like an electric motor. It's got but it sounds gruff. There's not actually many vibrations come from the engine, but it sounds really gruff. And it's got kind of the top end power of an inline four. So it's kind of all these things mixed into one. Yeah, the styling maybe probably a little bit bulky, but in race trim it looked absolutely gorgeous. I remember when people first saw that bike in the pit lane, when Spies was testing it during winter testing, it was absolutely stunning. And we really enjoyed it at the launch. It did a few strange things. It backed into corners quite a lot, which a few people didn't get on with, and you had to kind of get your head around that power delivery. The superpower of that bike was the way, and it still is, was the way it gets from full lean at an apex to the exit of the corner. It can just fly out of corners better than any other bike. It just finds loads of mechanical grip. That's its superpower. On the negative side, it doesn't make a lot of peak power, but that doesn't really matter because it flies out of corners so much. So the story of MCN's experience with this bike was we rode it at the launch and we really enjoyed it. We were lucky enough to get one of the first R1s in the UK to test it. So we put it in the back of a van with the Fireblade, which was the bike to beat at the time, the 08 Fireblade. And it was actually Steve Mercer and I drove down to the south of France in a van because it was still winter time, and we rode the bikes down the Route Napoleon, and they were really impressive. We had hot weather, we had good grip, and that superpower, the fact it could grunt away from any other four-cylinder, was the thing that was most impressive. And it actually left the blade for dead on roll-ons. So so far, launch good, first kind of comparison test good. Then we did a group test of it. We took all the thousands in 2009 to Cartagena. We rode them around the track again with Steve Mercer, did lap times. We rode them on the road, did a real thorough test of it with control tyres. And the R1 was fastest of all the thousands of the time, including 1198 Ducati as it was then. So it was a tick, 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 tick. Spees obviously did well on it. Leon Camier obviously did very well on it. He's the person that caused the lockdown, the showdown for BSB, because he just ran away with it. And it won championships all over the world. So if you look at the R1 like that, it was very successful. But then it didn't have a lot of success in other ways. So a lot of other magazines got hold of the bike later and didn't take the bikes to France. Maybe they rode it on rubbishy roads in the UK in the cold, where you saw the worst of the R1 on its standard tyres, which are really, really bad. The grip isn't so good because it's got such a lot of grunt. And it's quite a clumsy bike to ride slowly. It just likes being fast and flowing. And if you ride it in that slow environment, it's not very impressive. And then when it came to racing, a lot of super stock racers didn't want to touch it because it didn't make the peak power of the other bikes. The R1 never did very well at BSB later on, in the sort of Rob Mack years and in other sort of private hands. So it was a real tale of two halves of the R1. But it's kind of its time in the sunshine was pretty short-lived, because in 2010 the BMW S1000RR came out, and everybody quickly forgot about the R1 and started playing with the new toy. Yeah, I'd agree the looks don't look great. It does in race trim sometimes. There was a few successful ones in club racing, but the 15R1 is a lot better, much more compact, a lot easier to ride, a lot faster, a lot more powerful, and that's had a lot more success. I mean, a lot of club racers who went from S1000s to R1s immediately started winning. You know, it's quite an easy, friendly bike to ride fast. But, you know, if you ride an R1 now, it might feel a bit big. It also had traction control in 2012, which was interesting. We did some tests with some readers with traction control and kind of did blind tests with them to see if they could feel the traction control or not. Not many could, because the grip level on the road's quite high. We also went around Blyton's circuit on it. But interestingly, when we spoke to the readers and said, okay, let's turn the traction control off, everyone was a little bit nervous about turning it off. They all wanted traction control, even though most people think it gets in the way. We can talk a bit about traction control later on. But yeah, the R1, strange old thing, that cross-plane crank one, but still a great bike. And you know, it was very important when it came out. It was a real change in directions of superbikes, you know, from the norm of the normal inline fours. Then the R1 came out, then the S1000RR came out, and kind of everything changed. Everything became more electronically controlled and more powerful. So yeah, great question, and good to reminisce on that one, Mr. Doodle. Okay, next question is from Carl Michael. Thanks for your question. Too many bike journos are providing a basic overview but calling it a review. Funny how things like the buzziness of the engine or harsh suspension of the 790/890 when it came out was glossed over at launches. Then later some of the same journalists said that everything was great in their press launch videos, turned around in their real reviews and mentioned it. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks very much for your question. Yeah, I know what you mean. But what I would say is, you know, all the regular motorcycle journalists, all the old hacks, when we're at launches, everybody's got their own opinion, and everyone's opinion is valid, and everyone gives an honest opinion at a launch, I believe, and you know, you might agree with that or not. I mean, even among, you know, when we're talking the Brits together, when we're talking about the bikes, quite often it's like we're riding a different bike sometimes, because everybody wants something different from a bike, everybody rides differently. But what I would say is when you suddenly get a completely different opinion between the launch and the road test when you bring it back to the UK, is because manufacturers will always choose a location for their launch that puts their motorcycle in the best possible light. So, you know, a lot of launches of sports bikes are up mountain roads, you know, a lot of launches of touring bikes are big distance, etc., etc. And you can only comment on what the bike's like in that environment, and you can be very thorough with it. When you bring it back to the UK and kind of ride it out in the wild, you might find different elements of the bike that you hadn't noticed before, or different problems or different likes, whatever. But that also applies to when you bring it back to the UK, where you ride it independently. You know, you could ride a bike around Wales, all those beautiful roads all weekend, and think a bike's a certain way, but then you take it to London and get stuck in traffic, or ride it through Kent where there's no brilliant roads, and it would be a completely different animal. So, you know, where you test the bikes does make a big difference on how they are. Just I would say, you know, the final few percent, you know, the bulk of the bike review, you know, how a bike behaves is the same wherever you put it. But it's those sort of little details that you notice when you've got the bike in the wild that kind of could be different from the launch scenario. I think what you're getting at there is that maybe the launches aren't done thoroughly, or you may be influenced by what a manufacturer says, or, you know, there's a lot of talk about the fact that we go on these foreign launches, we get flown to a location, we get put in a hotel, we get treated nicely. You know, does that influence the road tester? Well, I think if it's an experienced road tester, definitely not. You know, you've got to ride these bikes somewhere. Most bikes get launched in the winter. If you tested them here in the UK, you wouldn't get any test, because the roads are slimy, it's freezing cold, and all the pictures would look rubbish. It wouldn't be aspirational, which is what you want to do when you see a video or read a magazine or a newspaper. You want to be there. It makes you dream. So you've got to go to these locations, and you can't let how you're treated at a launch influence your decision. And if it does, then you shouldn't really be doing it anyway. But yeah, so that's why you see differences. And also with launch bikes can always be different to the bikes you get in the UK. Quite often they're pre-production models. You know, in the past, you'll see things like, you know, track launches where the rear shocks of sports bikes have got spaces in them, in the top shock mount, to make the bike steer faster. There'll be all these little tips and tricks. Who knows if the suspension's blueprinted or the engines are blueprinted? You just don't know. You kind of got to take each bike as you find it. And, you know, generally they feel the same at the launch as they do back here, but you may notice some little difference depending on where you're riding it. But yeah, very interesting question. So thank you very much, Carl. The next one is from Cozy Mieras 634. Thanks for your question. Hey Michael, love your videos. Thank you very much. What do you think about traction control and track bikes? I recently got a big high side on my CBR 600RR track bike when cornering, coming out of a corner. It'll be some time till I can get back on the track, but I'm just wondering if it's worth it to invest in a bike that has traction control for a track bike. Does it help prevent high sides? Maybe I'm just a little bit stressed after the crash, but I'd like to prevent high sides in the future. Maybe you have some advice to give, as I think I was sitting way back in the seat, coming out of a corner, hard on the gas instead of standing on the pegs weight in the front. We'll be waiting for your next video. Cheers. Well, thanks so much for your question. Traction control on a track bike doesn't take away from the riding experience at all. It's just there as a nice little safety net. But traction control won't stop a high side. You only have to look at the recent MotoGP race from Catalonia and Pecco Bagnaio's massive high side. And those GP bikes are full of the best electronics in the world. And road bike electronics are really generic. So you can still crash with traction control. It doesn't hurt to get a bike with traction control on the track. Like I say, it's a safety aid. And it can be a performance aid as well. It can be a performance aid if you've got good enough traction control that it's not going to hold you back. But I would always say to kind of learn the basics of track riding first before you start to lean on traction control, because you can use traction control as a performance aid when you're in the right place at the right time with the right throttle, with the right lean angle and all the rest of it in a corner. It is a performance aid. But if you're using traction control just to go through the corner as fast as you can and just pin it, A, it's probably going to hold you back too much, and it will slow you down. And B, you can still crash. So, you know, I think I've said it a million times before in these videos. It's all about getting through the corners properly, and all the little things you've got to do on the way into the corner, through the corner, to set yourself up for the exit before you get on the throttle. All those things will help. Once you're doing that properly, then you can start to lean on the traction control, which is what I do when I go to a race meeting on my racing BMW. I set the traction control on quite intrusively to begin with, and I get used to the feeling of leaning on it coming out of corners. And then as the laps and the sessions progress, I turn the traction control down and down and down more, because I'm used to that feeling, to a point where you're going really, really fast. That's the only time I would use traction control as a performance aid. So in answer to your question, yes, get a bike with traction control by all means, but you can still high side. So to avoid that, get some on-track training, and then once you've done that, then you can start using traction control as a performance aid, and it's going to be a little bit of a safety buffer as well. So in terms of your riding position, you need to be right up the front of the bike, in the middle of the corner, leaning right over the front of it. The way to get there is to bend your arms and lean right over the front. And once you're there and you're coming out of the corner, you're kind of over the front of the bike anyway. If you're sitting too far back with straight arms, when you come out of the corner, the bike's going to just want to wheelie. And like you say, when the bike slides, you're part of the pendulum, and it's going to be very difficult to control the bike. Whereas if you're sitting right at the front, the pendulum's behind you, and it's like a motocross bike. If you're off-road, it's quite easy to wheel spin if you're leaning forward, and you can just let the back fishtail. It's not a problem at all because you're at the front. But if you're at the back, it's a different thing altogether. So, you know, the answer to all of these questions about kind of track riding is really to get some really good tuition and, you know, be in the right place at the right time, and then you can cut all your problems to the minimum. But great question. Thank you very much. Next is from Gary Shadbolt. Thanks for your question. I'm about to test ride 3 bikes for taking my partner and I on some big European tours from Corfu, where we live. BMW 1250 RT, the ultimate 2-up tourer, but perhaps a little bit physically big for Corfiot roads. Number 2, Triumph Tiger 1200 GT Explorer, the patriotic choice, but I'm a bit concerned by the reports of annoying vibrations at motorway cruising speeds. Moto Guzzi V100 Mandello S, the least powerful of the trio for 2-up, but the only one pulling at my heartstrings. Have you any comments as you've ridden them all? Thanks. Well, great question. 3 of the best sports tourers you've just mentioned there. The BMW is the most more towards the touring side. The Moto Guzzi is the most towards the sports side, and probably the Tiger's bang in the middle. The R1200 the reason it's so good is because it does the touring thing excellently, but it is sporty as well. It's a big bike, but you can really hustle it. But it depends how big those roads that you're taking are. But it's kind of the ultimate in comfort. For me, I would prefer something a little bit less cumbersome and a little bit sportier, which is why I would go for the Tiger. The Tiger in the corners handles like a supermoto. It's absolutely fantastic. It's one of the most comfortable bikes I've ever ridden. If you have a look at my long-term test reports on MCN's website and MCN's video, you'll see what it was like to live with. I really, really love that bike. Not very characterful, You know, it's easily forgettable once you're off of it. But it does its job of touring beautifully and really good two up. And then the Guzzi is kind of more of a one-up sports tourer, really. It's physically smaller than the other two. It's more of a kind of a weekend tourer rather than a real long distance 2-week tourer kind of thing. You know, the luggage is going to be a lot smaller, but in terms of character and performance, it beats the other two. I really, really like it. You know, this new Guzzi has kind of got one foot in the past with its kind of transversely mounted engine, although there's a debate about that, isn't it, if transverse is that way or that way, but either way it goes long ways in the bike rather than across the frame. There's a shaft drive, so it's kind of a little bit quirky when you're riding it. It rocks and it pitches a little bit, but not too much. But the bike basically made by Piaggio, the same people that make Aprilia, so it's got a lot of Aprilia DNA in terms of its handling. Even the dash is the same and the switchgear is the same. So I really like that bike. But I think if I was going to do what you're going to do, tour two up on some, you know, lovely roads, then I would probably head towards the Tiger. Thanks for your question. This one is from Carlos Martins, PT. Thanks very much for your question, mate. It's a question on wheelies. I watched some videos and tried out their tips, but still I never managed to, or had the nerve to really crack a proper wheelie. I'm a shorty, 5'4", and I ride a heavy and long bike, the BMW K1300R. I feel that one of my impediments is that I'm too propped up towards the front of the bike due to short arms, and so all the weight is there. What would you say? Give it up? No, don't give up. Never give up trying. The first thing I'd say is that your bike is very hard to wheelie because you quite rightly say it's very heavy and long. It takes a lot to get it up. And also it's got a shaft drive, which makes things a little bit more difficult as well. So I would just say you're trying to wheelie the wrong bike. I don't think your size is anything to do with it. I don't really think where you're sitting on the bike is anything to do with it. I think it's more your bike. I mean, I always recommend you try and wheelie a push bike before a motorbike because the feeling of the balance point is exactly the same. Whether you're on a motorbike or a push bike, and controlling a push bike wheelie with the back brake is the same as what you do on a motorbike. So, you know, the wheelie button of a motorbike is the clutch, is slipping the clutch and giving it some, like you would do if you wheel spin a car. You kind of give it a lot of revs with the clutch in and then you let the clutch out and it will wheel spin. It's the same on a bike, but sort of a little bit of a smoother transition. But if you watch the MCN How to Wheelie video we did ages ago, I think 2007, it's had millions of views. You know, you need to find some private ground obviously first before you try, but it's a question of getting used to the sort of the violence of acceleration that a wheelie dishes out. When you see someone do a wheelie, it just looks serene, doesn't it? But you're giving yourself maximum acceleration in a very short burst, so it feels violent, and that's part of the thing that puts you off. So if you get used to accelerating hard in first gear and just get used to the feeling of that acceleration, and then as you do it more and more, just feather the clutch to try and get the wheel a millimetre off the floor, get used to that feeling. Like anything with bikes, as we said before, it's all about building into it, you know, whether you're building into going fast, building into braking hard, building into get your knee down. It's the same with wheelies. You've got to just let it come to you and just come up slowly and slowly and slowly and slowly. The wheelies always feel a lot higher than they actually are, but to be honest, I probably wouldn't pursue that on your bike. Something like any one of the MT Yamahas are the best wheelie bikes out, you know, something like that, something a little bit with a bit more grunt, a little bit lighter, a little bit shorter. But yeah, if you crack it on the BMW, I'll tip my hat to you. You have to let me know you get on. Thanks for your question. Right, finally is from Squeeze Circa. Thanks very much for your question. thanks for the great content, no problem. Track day machine question. Would you rather buy a 10-year-old S1000RR that's already been set up with a track with good brakes and suspension and a lot of nice parts, or a more modern 2020 plus superbike but still stock? Which one would deliver the best for a track day rider? Asking for a friend. Well, tell your friend this. That's a really interesting question. On paper, you'd want a bike that's someone's already spent all the money on, somebody's already taken the time to set up, and then you can just put some fuel in and go and have a bit of fun around the track. You know, with a track bike, you want good suspension, but you need good brakes. But the thing is, you need to know exactly the spec of all those race parts. So if you buy a bike with nice shiny Öhlins suspension, that's not necessarily going to be your answer if that suspension has got the wrong springs, for example. You need to, as soon as you get into race suspension, then you need to have specific springs for your weight and your riding style and where you're going to ride the bike. So, you know, you'd need to look at that. You need to look at the way the bike's set up with geometry. Someone might have added more ride height to the rear, slid the forks up and down through the yokes to change the ride height there. The thing with ex-track bikes is you don't really know their history, you know, unless you know the person who's got it and you've seen what they've done with it all the way through, and obviously they've been thrashed as well. So although on the face of it, getting an ex-track bike is a good idea, I'd probably go the other way and start with a bike that you know its history, and then you can kind of start chipping away with it. So in terms of a 2020 plus S1000RR, there's not actually that much you need to do to it. You could get away with doing track days with just tyres. The suspension's good enough, the brakes are more than good enough, the electronics are good enough, the quick shift is good enough, and you can just stick fuel in it and lap to your heart's content. I think the first thing I would do if I was turning an S1000RR into a track bike would be suspension, fork kit and a rear shock, but with the correct springs. I wouldn't necessarily do anything to the brakes. Maybe you could put some slightly racier pads in, but the standard pads are really good. Tyres, obviously, and then bodywork. That's probably all I would do. Maybe gearing as well. With S1000s, kind of a, what did we used to use? Like a 1644, 1645 as a kind of a one gear fits all kind of circuits in the UK, more or less. So yeah, I would get a bike you know the history of, because you never know, you know, track bikes are used and abused, aren't they? And sometimes not set up in the best way. And you might be buying yourself a load of problems. Whereas, you know, the whole point of a track day is to just go and enjoy yourself, and, you know, the bike should be sort of melting into the background really while you have a good time. So yeah, get the standard one and throw a few parts at it. So that's it for this Q&A. Thank you very much for watching. Keep those questions and comments coming in, and I will see you soon.